Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. I'm Ryan the Nature Gamer. Today we're doing another read aloud of Budding Prospects by T.C. Boyle. We're going to be reading chapter 4 today, and I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you enjoy the video. So without further ado, chapter 4. Perhaps it was the strange bed, the smell of the sheets, and my excited imagination. Maybe a little closer here. Sorry about the shakiness. Perhaps it was a strange bed, the smell of the sheets, and my excited imagination, but my dreams that night were exclusively erotic. Faces leered and tongues lapped. A thicket of pubic hair sprang from the ground. Breasts and buttocks sprouted beneath me like vegetables, like fruit ripe and wet and stippled with dew. Then I was downstairs in the ballroom. Aorta was pinned to me naked. Her tongue was in my mouth. Pasta bubbled on the stove. A legion of stuffed otters, beavers, and bobcats stiffened their hackles. She was massaging my abdomen with a strange, stiff bristle of her bleached hair. Then she broke away. Cruel and silent as the Sphinx, she shifted around the room, playing with herself, taunting me until I lunged for her. In one of those odd conjunctions of dream and reality, I was awakened by her voice. Felix, she was saying, her voice throaty and raw, as if cracked with sexual exhaustion. Everybody's up. I forced my eyes open. She was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a white robe, and she looked smaller than I remembered her, shrunken somehow, vulnerable. It was a moment before I realized what it was. She wasn't wearing any makeup. No black lipstick, no punctured eyes, no skin-prickling claws. Vogelsang's making breakfast, she whispered, hoarse, and then turned and shuffled off down the hallway. She was right. He was making breakfast. I could smell it. Coffee, Canadian bacon, flapjacks, eggs. The aura of the logging camp suffused the room, penetrated to the core of my being, and in the instant, the generative urge gave way to the alimentary. I jerked myself up and fumbled through my duffel bag for one of the new flannel shirts I bought for the summer camp. It was cold. As I buttoned the shirt, bacon in my nostrils, the chill air slapping at my thighs like a cold hand, I looked round the room with satisfaction. A moose head hovered over the bed, and the split pine walls glistened with varnish. My jacket hung, simplicity itself, from a coat tree in the corner. I slipped into my jeans and work boots, feeling like a candidate for a cigarette ad. Downstairs in the big room we'd vacated in the dark, full of dark fears, there was a flood of sunlight. Everything was gleaming, pricked with light, from the glass of the display cases and the burnished copper of the espresso machine to the wild, grinning eye Phil cast at me as I stepped through the doorway and held my hands out to the hissing fire. Phil was already at the table, hunched over a mound of flapjacks and a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice. Gesh sat beside him, his plate empty, a Bloody Mary clutched in his hand as if it were the ejection lever of a flaming jet. I listened to the distant whine of a tea kettle and to Vivaldi, who was measuring out the irretrievable moments as if to be sure we all had enough. Vogelsang startled me. He slammed through the kitchen door, arms laden, coffee pot, pitcher of cream, a platter of eggs, and poaching cups flanked by flat red slabs of bacon. He was wound up, so brisk he seemed awkward, each movement an effort to contain the flashes of energy that jerked at his fingers and set his limbs a-tremble. I thought he was going to lift off the floor and flap around the room, like a cockatiel sprung from its cage, but he managed instead to set the platter down and boom a greeting at me. "Felix," he shouted, "it's about time." He was wearing a running suit, chevrons at his shoulders, stripes down the seams of the legs. Too loudly and far too cheerfully, he informed me that he'd already run 7 miles and loaded the back of the pickup with our equipment. I sat down and began to consume eggs. Vogelsang crouched at the head of the table, lecturing in spasms, alternately gulping fistfuls of garlic pills and ginseng and dosing himself with breath neutralizer. "Picks, shovels, a wheelbarrow," he said, interrupting himself to swallow a desiccated liver tablet. "A couple of rolls of barbed wire and a come-along, and 2 little Kawasaki's I've just finished overhauling. It's all in the truck, plus some odds and ends. An axe, a set of socket wrenches, claw hammer, that sort of thing. Oh, and the 2x4s and whatnot for the greenhouse. Boyd will be up there at the end of the week, and he's going to bring up the worm castings and seeds and all the rest in his van." Gesh was wearing a torn flannel shirt that featured cowboys with lariats. His hair was in aboriginal disarray, and his eyes looked as if they'd been freshly transplanted. He mixed himself another Bloody Mary, then threw back 2 Quaaludes and gave us a sick grin. "You'll need the bikes for patrolling the place once you get the crop in. 390 acres is no putting green, you know, and for handling the irrigation system during the dry months. But the first thing you've got to do, and this is vitally important, is to get that fencing up." Vogelsang paused to shake the vial of the breath spray irritably, set it down on the table, and fumbled in his pocket for another. Phil was reading the sports page. Gesh looked as if he were about to fall into his drink. Half an hour later, we were milling around Vogelsang's driveway, preparatory to setting off on the 4-hour drive to Mendocino County, in the wild venue we would tame like the pioneers and prospectors we were. Gravel crunched under our feet. Birds piped and throbbled. Sunlight fell through the trees with a cheering insistence in the air was like milk. Vogelsang was fussing around the vehicles, cinching ropes and rearranging cartons of supplies, but I wasn't paying him any attention. I was feeling the pulse of things, suddenly aware of the richness of color and texture you take for granted until you see it represented in oils or illuminating the big screen in a darkened theater. The smell of eucalyptus was as sharp as recollection. Then Vogelsang was pumping my hand. Aorta stood beside him, restored to impermeability behind her layers of makeup and a black flannel jacket. Good luck, Vogelsang said, reasserting his promise to look in on us in a week or so. Phil fired up the vehicle our benefactor had provided for us, an ancient fender-punched Datsun pickup, and I climbed into the Toyota beside Gesh. "Where's the ticker tape?" I called, grinning as I turned over the engine and wheeled up the drive, feeling heroic, poised on the verge of greatness, ready for anything. The gears clattered. I waved my arm off. Phil fell in behind me, and Gesh began to snore. By the time we reached Santa Rosa, the sky was the color of dishwasher, and the sunk so low I had to turn the lights on. At Cloverdale, just below the Mendocino County line, and 50 miles or so from Willits, our point of reference, it began to rain. Not with a burst of lightning or a roll of thunder, but with a sudden crashing fall characteristic of coastal precipitation. The hammering on the roof woke Gesh. He said he felt like shit, raw and unadulterated, he added, slitting a cellophane Mandrax packet with his teeth. How about we stop for a cup of coffee and wait till it clears? We watched the water heave down the windows of the Hopland coffee shop in big scalloped sheets. It was so dark it could have been dusk shading into night. Phil was soaked through. Apparently the truck's window wouldn't roll up. Just my luck, he said gloomily, and asked Gesh for some pharmaceutical help. Gesh, who seemed to have an unlimited supply, slipped him 3 Quaaludes. I took 2, for equilibrium. It was 10:30 in the morning. We waited until the waitress stopped refilling our coffee cups, shrugged our shoulders, and hunched out into the rain. Willits, the Rainbirds line, announced some 50 minutes later, had a population of 4,120 and stood at an elevation of 1,377 feet. We passed a series of diners, motels, and gas stations, Al's Redwood Room, and a Safeway Market. The town seemed contained in a single strip, stretched out along Highway 101 for the convenience of tourists intent on the redwood forest to the north. It was as bleak and barren and uninspiring as an iceberg bobbing in the Bering Sea. Gesh and I caught glimpses of it through the beating windshield wipers. For the next 9 months, I said, a trace of retardation in my voice as a result of the drug, which shifts your system down a couple of gears into a sort of pre-hibernatory torpor. This is our closest urban center. Urban center, Gesh repeated, his voice as lugubrious as a nose blow. Shit. 15 miles north of Willits, we were to turn off on a blacktop road, follow it past a place called Shirell's Bum Steer and 6 or 7 tumble-down farms, and then up a gravel drive to a gate that opened on 5.3 miles of unimproved dirt road. To quote Vogelsang's directions, fine, but it was raining so hard we missed the turnoff and Phil nearly slammed into my tail when I braked to cut a U-turn. I rattled up on the shoulder, hit the emergency flasher, and ran back to confer with him. The intensity of the rain was staggering. I felt I was carrying a sack of potatoes on my back as I jogged through the 20 steps to the pickup and poked my head through the open window. Rain tore at the back of my neck and set exploratory tributaries down the collar of my jacket. A lone logging truck hissed up the highway, spewing water, and vanished in the haze. What's the story? Phil mumbled, each word played out on a string like a yo-yo winding down. The sagging pompadour was flattened across his forehead, and a drop of water depended from his nose. Vogelsang said 15 miles from Willits. I read 15.5 in my odometer. The road we just passed must be it. Phil was shivering. The iris of his wild eye looked like an ice crystal in a cocktail glass. Christ, he moaned, I hope so. All I want to do now is sit in front of a fire and crash for a couple of hours. Shirell's Bum Steer greeted us like a shout of affirmation as we lurched across the highway and onto the presumptive road. I could hear Phil honking his joy behind me as we sped past the place, a ramshackle country bar attached to a house in need of paint. A pair of mud-streaked pickups huddled beneath a drooling oak out front. The hand-lettered sign was pitched at a drunken angle, and a single sad Coors neon glowed in the window like a candle at the shrine of a martyr. I took it in at a glance, noting bleakly that this was our nearest outpost of civilization. The land of the rednecks, Gesh muttered, and added that he felt like Lewis of Lewis and Clark, or maybe it was Clark. And then we were rattling over a raging tributary of the Eel River. In the summer we would subside to a series of fetid, mosquito-breeding pools, and threading our way up a valley between cropped, long-faced hills that bristled with pine like so many unshaven cheeks. We were counting off tumble-down farms and scouring the left-hand side of the road for a block of stone that protruded from the ground like an admonitory finger, our indication to swing into the next road to our right, when Guest shouted, "Eureka!" And I cut hard into a dirt road that was coincidentally the brown rippling bed of a stream. Suddenly we were going uphill, climbing a precipice, the tires groping for purchase, water slashing at the fenders, the engine cranking with propulsive whine and carrying us 50 or 60 feet in a headlong rush before the wheels sank to the hubcaps in a sea of reddish mud. Phil, loaded down with the barbed wire and Kawasaki's, was able to develop better traction and careened wildly up the hill into the back of the stalled Toyota. I don't recall the sound effects, whether there was a crunch or a shriek or a thud. But my head flew forward as if on an urgent journey of its own. The windshield groaned and then flowered into the silver filigree, and the trunk latch popped open forever. I looked at Gesh. He was cursing, and there was blood on his forearm. Then we were all out in the downpour, ankle deep in the mud and whirling water. Trees loomed over us like cupped black hands. The rain lashed our faces with 1,000 stings. I rubbed my forehead and discovered that an object the size and consistency of a golf ball had been inserted beneath the skin, in the vicinity of my left eyebrow. For a moment we just stood there, hunched like lost souls awaiting the ferry across the river of lamentation, cursing softly. Then Gesh plunged into the undergrowth like an enraged bull, tearing at ferns and briars and poison oak, knocking down saplings, uprooting stumps. I thought he'd gone mad. Meanwhile, Phil had begun to dance around the road, wringing his hands and rotating his head as if he were trying out an esoteric new routine for Alvin Ailey. "Hey, I didn't know," he began, but I waved him off. "I'm okay," I said, noting at the same time, and with the dispassion of a man in the movie theater watching the Lusitania go down, that my duffel bag had been thrown from the trunk into the center of the stream bed. The heavy khaki coat cloth had gone dark with wet, and debris had already begun to collect against it. Inside were my shirts, my socks, my underwear, and my sweaters. I took hold of the dripping strap and jerked the bag up out of the mud, nearly dislocating my shoulder in the process. Phil helped me heave the sodden thing back into the trunk, and together we managed to secure the ruptured latch with a piece of wire. Suddenly Gesh emerged from the woods, his face cross-hatched with welts and contusions, the trench coat flapping about his knees. He was dragging a down tree the size of a battering ram. For a moment we just stood there gaping at him, our hands at our sides, rain crashing through the trees, mud swirling at our feet. It was as if we'd just been wakened from the dream of sleeping. "Christ's ass," Gesh shouted. "Give me a hand, will you?" I could feel the drug loosen its grip. Think of a crouton drawn from a pot of fondue. And then I was at Gesh's side, jerking furiously at the wet, moss-covered log. Phil fell in beside me, and we maneuvered the thing alongside the car, and staggered into the undergrowth for another. We worked silently, grunting at one another, each locked in his own thoughts. I was thinking of hot showers, hot soup, electric blankets, and thermal underwear. Everything dripped. Thorns raked at our wrists and faces. Soap bugs crept up our arms. Rain hissed in the branches like a stadium packed with disgruntled fans. As Phil and I wrestled with a half-petrified log, Gesh jacked the Toyota out of the mud. All right, push, he exhorted, the jack at its apogee, and the three of us leaned into the fender and then jumped back as the car slammed down under the makeshift platform with a percussive splintering rack. Then we jacked up the other side. There was a smell of slow rot on the air, of mold and compost. Birds mocked us from the trees. Our hands and faces were black with loam, as if we'd been buried and unearthed and buried again. Gesh tried to light a cigarette. His pants were torn to the knee, and the trench coat hung from him like a wet beach towel. Phil was clowning. He bent to scoop up a handful of mud and slap it down across the crown of his head, like Stan Laurel at the conclusion of a pie-throwing skirmish. It wasn't funny. "Okay," Gesh growled, flinging down the wet cigarette and spreading his big hands across the indented bumper of the Toyota. "Why don't you see what you can do?" I wiped my hands in the seat of my pants and slid into the driver's seat. The car was musty and cold, the windows opaque with wet. I turned the key, took note of the answering roar. We'd lost the muffler, apparently, and watched the wipers flail out the rain. Then I revved up the engine, peeled the bark from the logs, and hydroplaned up the road as far as I could go. My co-workers flogging madly behind me like refugees chasing after the Red Cross wagon. When I bogged down, the whole process started over again. Heave, haul, crank, shove. Sometimes I managed to make a couple of 100 feet. Other times I'd come wheeling off the log bed and sink instantaneously in the mud. The rain was no help. It fell steadily all afternoon. And we were, as I was later to discover, climbing a vertical drop of something like 600 feet from the blacktop road to the cabin. Finally, after 4.5 backbreaking hours, we reached a point at which the road began to level out, and when I came off the launching pad for what must have been the 20th time, I kept going. The cars fishtailed left and right, low-hanging branches swooped into the windshield. The cheers of my partners faded in the background, and I kept going. There was a short straightaway, a series of S-curves, and then a wide sweeping loop that brought me up in the rain into a rain screen clearing about the size and shape of a Little League field. I didn't know where I was going, slashing through swathes of waist-high weed and thumping over frame-rattling boulders and mounds of rusted machine parts, hooked on the idea of momentum, until I saw the cabin. No, I thought, no, this can't be it. As I slammed on the brakes and skidded into a heap of scrap metal that featured a rusted box spring and the exoskeleton of the first washing machine ever made. I'd experienced hiatuses between expectation and actuality before. Who hasn't? But this was staggering. Hunting lodge. Hunting lodge? The place was an extended shack, the yard strewn with refuse, the doorway gaping like an open mouth, like the hungry maw of a demon god of abandoned houses demanding propitiation. Someone, Vogelsang no doubt, had nailed tarp paper up on the outer walls in the place of shingles, and there was a ridiculous white cloud of sheet styrofoam lashed across the roof, in the hope of forestalling leaks, as I was later to learn. One thing I was sure of even then, sitting stunned behind the fractured windshield of the stalled Toyota, no one had lived in the place for 20 years or more. Inside it was worse. The roof leaked in 8 places. The front door had blown in and torn back from its hinges. A furious collision of sumac and vetch darkened the windows. I dropped my duffel bag on the cracked linoleum floor, a floral pattern popular in the 40s, and walked round the main room as if I were touring a museum. The room was L-shaped, roughly divided into kitchen and parlor. I paused over the 22-inch holes that were in the 22 round holes in the kitchen wall, the gas-powered refrigerator that had been non-functional for 30 years, the sink stained with the refuse of forgotten meals. There were 2 small bedrooms off the parlor and a crude staircase that led to a third in the attic. The kitchen door gave onto a partially enclosed porch that connected with a dilapidated storage shed. Beyond the storage shed, a rust-pitted propane tank, pro-flame, and a grim tree-choked ravine. I took all this in, shivering, and then turned to the stove. There were 2 stoves, actually. One was a range, combination gas and wood, circa 1935, and the other was a squat wood stove made of cast iron. There was no wood. All the clothes I owned were soaked through. My shoulders had begun to quake involuntarily. I was exhaling clouds. Something had to be done. Beyond the brown windows lay 390 acres of pine, hardwood and scrub, every stick of it wet as a sponge. I pictured myself peeling back strips of sodden bark, and dissolved the image as abruptly as I might have switched channels on the TV. Then I thought of the storage room and slammed through the kitchen door in a rush, inadvertently flushing a bird that had been roosting in the porch beams. It flew up in my face like a bad dream, and then it was gone. The storage room was penumbral, cluttered with refuse. There were bundles of yellow newspaper, Truman Calls for Fair Deal, DiMaggio unravels socks, staved-in gasoline cans, and remnants of what might once have been a hand loom. I stepped into the low-ceilinged room as I might have stepped into Pharaoh's tomb, treading carefully, keeping an eye out for lucre, or rather, in this case, the merest splinter of anything combustible, among the heaps of rags, cans, and bottles that flowed across the floor and slapped at the walls like the spillage of some diluvian tide. Dust lay over everything, white as a pulverized bone. When I snapped a chair leg across my knee, a pair of sleek, dark forms shot through the jagged window on the near side of the room. Rats, I thought absently, maybe ground squirrels. 5 minutes later, I had a respectable pile of furniture fragments and odd pieces of lumber. I set it atop a bundle of mildewed newspaper, hauled the whole mess back into the main room, checked the flue in the stovepipe, and realized I didn't have any matches. This was too much, I cursed. I kicked something, and then threw myself down on the stinking sun-faded sofa opposite the cold stove. Dust rose in a mighty swirling mushroom cloud and settled on my wet jacket. For a while I just sat there shivering, listening to the rain percolate through the ceiling and spatter the ancient linoleum, the storm laying down in a screen of static outside. There I heard the laboring engine of Phil's pickup churning its way up the mountain. They were in for a surprise, I thought, lifting myself from the sofa and gazing out through the open door at the raked and rugged hills, the trees like claws, the gray distance I couldn't begin to suggest the gaps between ridges. Impatient, jittery, wet to the bone, I paced the room half a dozen times and then thought of looking over the bedrooms again, with an eye to staking a claim on one of them. The nearest was unremarkable, 4 walls crudely done. Some misguided soul had attempted to put up slabs of sheetrock and had given up halfway through the job. A torn mattress set atop a box spring, a broom handle nailed diagonally across the far corner to serve as a clothing rack. I moved past it down the narrow hallway that led to the bathroom, and then into the back bedroom. It was as spare in a scene as the first. The walls were pine slats. There was a box spring propped up on a wooden packing crate. An unfinished window looked out on the trees. At first I almost missed the calendar nailed to the inside of the door. But the door swung onto uneven hinges, and when I turned it, it was staring me in the face. A calendar. I could hear the pickup rattling into the yard, the engine wheezing like a miler's lungs. The picture over the month and date portion of the calendar featured a woman in a cloche hat, her face averted, skirt pinched to reveal her legs, a dull brownish Norman Rockwell sort of thing. But it wasn't the picture that caught my eye. It was the year, 1949, the year I was born. Odd, I thought, and then I noticed the month, November, my month. I could feel the blood rushing into my stomach as if it had been hit in the midsection, the impossible nagging cosmic joke of it, the heavy black pencil strokes, an act of the will, irrefutable, closing in on the very day, my birthday, circled in black. I stepped back involuntarily. "Hey, Felix," Gus was shouting from the front room. "You in there?" It was one of those moments that annihilate a lifetime of empirical assumptions with a sudden mocking laugh. "Felix?" Gus shouted. I stepped back another pace, as bewildered and disoriented as if I had just been slapped. Something was wrong here, and I didn't like it. From childhood I had been taught that there were answers for everything, that the square root of 4 was 2, that the sky was blue because of the diffraction of light through dust particles in the atmosphere, that life originated from the action of an electrical charge on simple proteins. I was not superstitious. Like anyone else, I knew that in an infinite and multifarious universe, the most bizarre coincidences were commonplace, were calculable probabilities. Nonetheless, I wanted to quit, right then, right there, my face smarting and heart hammering. I wanted to quit. And that's the end of part 1. Next time I'll do part 2, germination, where they start to make the weed farm. And thank you for joining me. I hope you guys are all well. And I will see you in the next video. Peace out.